What writer has had the largest number of professed and devoted followers so far in literary history? The Holy Bible has to be dismissed from the competition. Although referred to by devout men as the Word of God, it is in publishing terms an anthology. That leaves only two contenders, Karl Marx and Muhammad. By any accounting, the followers of Marx now greatly outnumber the sons of the prophet. Karl Marx, we should know, was not one but many men, a truly prodigious congregation. The world celebrates him as a revolutionary, the parent of revolution. He was also a very great social scientist. Many would say with justice, the most original and imaginative economist and the most erudite political philosopher of his age. He was also a brilliant journalist. All American Republicans should note with pride that during an exceptionally meager time in his life, Marx was sustained by the New York Tribune, and he was thought its best correspondent. Marx was also an historian with a living sense of history. This was most important. Perhaps it is a sense of history that divides good economics from bad economics. Anyway, I've often thought so. This is the pleasant house where Marx was born. It is a museum, a modest tourist attraction, a small source of profit for the now rather conservative Rhineland town of Trier. Trier, or Trev, is at the head of the Mosel Valley. In 1818, it was a lovely part of Europe, and it still is.
In 1835, Marx went to Bonn to study law, and from there to Berlin. But he'd already fallen in love with Jenny von Westphalen, a childhood friend, and from Bonn he sent her poems.
I could 1,000 volumes fill, writing only Jenny in each line. Still they would a world of thought conceal, verses sweet that yearning gently still.
You might not think much of that, but it hardly fits the soulless image presented by his enemies and his communist supporters. Marx asked Jenny to marry him, but she was uncertain. Her half-brother Ferdinand, a government official, was even more dubious and asked the Berlin police to follow Marx and keep him in touch with Marx's club. The police told Ferdinand that Marx wasn't attending his lectures and spent his time arguing about God and drinking wine by the litre. Like many Berlin students drawn towards radical ideas at the time, Marx joined a group called the Young Hegelians, dedicated to the ideas of the philosopher Hegel. And Hegel was not an easy philosopher to follow.
Hegel had been dead for 5 years, but his life force in the University of Berlin remained wholly undimmed. Marx was profoundly influenced, an influence that would last for his lifetime. Hegel is not easy for the Anglo-Saxon or American mind. My feeling for his ideas, I confess, has always been a little insecure. What Hegel called the dialectic was the enduring conflict by which man achieves liberation and perfection, a life ruled by reason. The conflict is between opposites, theses and antitheses, leading to a new synthesis. Thus, from the conflict between savagery and law comes freedom, the new synthesis. But freedom as the new synthesis nurtures new conflicts. History is this process of constant transformation.
So Hegel was saying that everything, nations, language, family units, take place as a result of constant change, and there's nothing natural about any of them.
But then he went on to argue that this change is a continuing process.
And most of the time it happens behind the surface, invisible. So take a potato. You can look at a potato all day and it won't appear to change, but beneath the surface it's gradually rotting. It doesn't rot for a day and then have a rest from rotting. It rots continuously until one day it falls apart in an apparently sudden change.
How did it come about that a philosopher who was so obscure and so difficult to understand acquired, even in his lifetime, such immense influence?
I think that's partly due to his situation at the University of Berlin, which was the capital of Prussia, which was then the rising state in Germany at the time, and also due to the fertility of his ideas in a variety of fields. You see, the influence that Hegel had is not just an influence in philosophy, it's an influence in theology, in history, in politics, in economics even, in law. Now, the fact that Hegel's ideas could be applied in those ways shows how fruitful his approach, and particularly the historical elements of his approach were, because it was that historical idea of things as having developed, as being a process, that could be applied by scholars in all these different areas.
Let's come now to the immediate afterlife of Hegel's ideas. One of the first things that happened when he died was that his followers split into two movements, didn't they? They were known as the young Hegelians and the old Hegelians, or alternatively, the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians. Can you tell us something about this division?
The right Hegelians were the people who thought that Hegel's philosophy implied that something like the Prussian state was the organic state which Hegel was pointing to. They thought that Hegel had himself said this in the Philosophy of Right, his most explicitly political work. He described a state, a constitutional monarchy, not very different from the Prussian state. And so they thought that there was no need really for further change. They were the conservative or right-wing Hegelians. The left Hegelians said, the basic thrust of Hegel's philosophy is much more radical than that. You see, Hegel talked, as we said at the beginning, about overcoming the division between reason and desire, or between morality and self-interest. That's a very fundamental change to bring about. You can't say that that's occurred in the Prussia of 1830 or whatever. So they said the thrust of Hegel's philosophy is for a much more far-reaching change, a revolutionary change. Now, they had to admit that in the Philosophy of Right, Hegel hadn't written as if he were revolutionary, but they'd pointed out the fact that Hegel's salary was paid by the state of Prussia. So they said Hegel compromised. He sold out. But we must be truer to Hegel than Hegel was to himself. We must carry the ideas forward until we get to the point at which these thesis-antithesis of reason and desire, morality and self-interest are overcome, and we reach the synthesis of a harmonious society in which those gulfs and divisions in human nature are reconciled.
Marx agreed with this, but concluded that there was a flaw with Hegel's theory, because for Hegel, changes in society were driven by ideas. And in this sense, Marx said, Hegel was upside down, because it's not the ideas in our head that determine the lives we lead, it's the lives we lead that determine our ideas.
And with all else, Marx was an atheist in a century that took religion very seriously. Not a passive, but an active atheist. In one of his memorable passages, he described religion as the opium of the people. It taught them to acquiesce patiently in hardship and in exploitation when they should rise up in angry revolt.
After 5 years in Berlin, Marx had become a renowned doctor of philosophy, but he'd also become aware of its limitations.
The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it.
In 1841, Marx left Berlin. He would henceforth himself be a part of the Hegelian process, one of the great instruments of its transformation.
He became the editor of a liberal newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung, and he wrote his theories in a book called The Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, which might not sound like a snappy title, but compare it to his first works.
The Holy Family, or Critique of Critical Criticism against Bruno Bauer and Company.
Or this one.
Critique of Modern German Philosophy according to its representatives Feuerbach, Bauer and Stirner, and of German Socialism according to its various prophets.
I bet his publishers love that.
I love the bit about the potato. It's just the title. We were thinking something a little more streetwise. The Naked Philosopher.
He went soon to Cologne, like Trier, also recently redeemed from France, and more liberal for the experience. In France, what wasn't prohibited was permitted, but in Prussia, what wasn't permitted was prohibited. In this environment, Marx became a journalist, and he was an immediate success. He was a good journalist, careful, intelligent, intense. His language was varied and resourceful, with much indication of the solid power to come. The Rheinische Zeitung was being financed by the rising industrialists of the Rhine and the Ruhr. For them, Marx was a force for progress, an apostle of the modern economic world, liberalism, freedom of enterprise if that was the choice, as opposed to the dead hand of feudalism with all its restrictions and restraints. They soon made him editor. He was also a force for moderation. The word communism, though still indistinct as to meaning, was now coming into use. Marx described some of the contributions to his newspaper.
Scrawls, pregnant with world revolution and empty of thought, written in slovenly style and flavored with some atheism and communism which these gentlemen have never studied. I declared that I considered the smuggling of communist and socialist ideas into casual theatre reviews was unsuitable, indeed immoral.
Marx, quite possibly, should be brought back to deal with some modern radical literature. Under Marx, the paper grew in circulation and in influence over Germany, and in interest to the censors who thoughtfully reviewed the proofs of each issue each night before it went to press. They were constantly disturbed, but especially by Marx, on dead wood. Wood was a metaphor of Marx's thought of the time. Anciently, the people of the Rhineland had gone to the forest for firewood. Now wood had become valuable, and the right was withdrawn. Public property had become private property. David McClellan, to whose fine biography of Marx I'm very much indebted, tells how the cases against wood and against the wood collectors clogged the courts at the time. Marx thought private property ought to be defended with some discretion.
If every violation of property, without distinction or more precise determination, is theft, would not all private property be theft? Through my private property, do not I deprive another person of this property?
In these same months of 1842, Marx came to the support of old neighbors, the wine growers of the Mosel Valley. They were suffering severely from competition under the Zollverein, the common market that the German states had recently adopted. Again, no one will think his solution extreme.
To resolve the difficulty, the administration and the administered both need a third element, which is political without being official and bureaucratic. An element which at the same time represents the citizen without being directly involved in private interests. Now, this resolving element, composed of a political mind and a civic heart, is a free press.
So there was Marx, the defender of freedom of the press. He also, in his columns, criticized the Russian Tsar and urged a more secular approach to divorce. Obviously, this sort of thing could not go on. In March 1843, the Prussian government cracked down, suppressed the paper. Physically, Marx's German years were now over. In spirit, he would return to Germany again and again. Wherever Marx might be, his thoughts would return to the land of his birth and of his education. And before leaving this time, he forged a new tie. He went to Krusnach and married Jenny. A little earlier, she had written to urge him, come what may, to keep clear of politics. That was indeed a slender hope. By autumn, Marx and Jenny were in Paris, at the very center of the political life and debate of the age. Here all that was new began, or so anyhow it seemed. The Great Revolution was only 50 years in the past, that of 1831 only 12 years before, and that of 1848 less than 5 years ahead. Marx and his wife lived here on the left bank in the Rue Venot. The Marx family lived at several addresses along this street, for the longest time here at number 38. Once he was settled here in Paris, Marx got ahead with his next journalistic enterprise, the editing of the Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher, the German-French yearbooks, really a magazine. By calling it a book, he hoped to avoid censorship. The reference to France in the title was a gesture. Though he was here in Paris, Marx's thoughts at this time were almost wholly on Germany.
In France, every class of the people is politically idealistic. and is not primarily conscious of itself as a particular class, but as a representative of general social needs. The proletariat is only beginning to exist in Germany through the invasion of the industrial movement. Thus, we are now starting to begin in Germany when France and England are beginning to end. When all interior conditions are fulfilled, the day of German resurrection will be heralded by the crowing of the Gallic cock.
I judge him to be saying only that change in Germany, peaceful or otherwise, would follow change in France. However, the Prussian police were very sensitive men. They decided that this was dangerous stuff. So the first double issue of the yearbook was confiscated at the border. There were now no German readers. There never had been any French readers or contributors. So the publication was obviously in trouble. Marx, by this time, was also quarreling with his fellow editor. So the German-French yearbook came to an end. The first issue was the last. In the next weeks, however, something more important happened. A traveler arrived in Paris and came to see Marx. It was Friedrich Engels. There had been a previous casual encounter, and now they met in a cafe, met again, talked further, and formed what was to be a lifelong bond. Engels would be Marx's editor, collaborator, admirer, and banker of last resort.
After this bonding, the pair formed a partnership that would carry on for the rest of their lives. They wrote dozens of books together and thousands of letters to each other, including one from Marx about the Empress Eugenie.
She suffers, it seems, from a most indelicate complaint. She is passionately addicted to farting and is incapable, even in company, of suppressing it. It's only a little murmur, but as you know, the French are sensitive to the slightest puff of wind.
But Marx's life was not spent talking in the cafes, but in these rooms. Marx now settled down for a period of serious reading and study, perhaps the most intense of his life. This was the time when many of the ideas which were to dominate his later years took form. One I think I should mention in particular. It has variously been called economic determinism or the materialist conception of history. The accepted ideas of any period are those that serve the dominant economic interest.
Political economy starts from labor as the very soul of production, and yet it attributes nothing to labor and everything to private property. Intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed. The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of the ruling class.
I must say I've never thought that Marx was wrong on that proposition. Social truth in our time has a fairly remarkable way of serving important economic interest. One yearns for an age when policemen were aroused by thoughts like that. But the Prussian police were aroused. They complained to the French authorities. To harbor a writer, such a writer, was not a neighborly act. It called for a friendly, fraternal gesture of repression. So Guizot, the French Minister of the Interior, issued an order for Marx's expulsion. That was on January 25, 1845. And on 24 hours' notice, the Marx family, there was now a baby girl, departed for Brussels. Brussels was a pleasant helm, also a base for more travel, to England to continue his association with Engels, and for meetings of the newly founded Communist League. For the Communist League in 1848, Marx, with Engels, composed the tract that after 125 years still rings in men's ears. That was the Communist Manifesto.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes.
The Communist Manifesto was incomparably the most successful political tract of all time. To this day, when politicians proclaim their program, the organ tones of the manifesto, if not the content, sound through the hall.
It, the bourgeoisie, has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. During its rule of scarce 100 years, it has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together.
Marx's attitude towards capitalism is basically ambiguous. At the same time, he was honest here, Marx, ultra fascinated. He was fully aware that this is the most productive, dynamic system in the history of humanity, and so on.
The truth is, Marx did understand that the drive for profit would achieve incredible things. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It's accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades.
He did really get the kind of global aspect. He got the idea that people were suddenly being able to get things from all the way around the world in a completely new way, and the impact of that.
The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. It creates a world after its own image.
The manifesto is not without contradictions. There is, in fact, none between Marx's praise of capitalism and its accomplishments and his promise of its extinction. These are different stages in the historical process. Nor, as pedants have suggested, is there any real conflict between his call for action and the revolution that he held to be inevitable. Why not advance the inevitable?
The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite.
But there is conflict between his immediate program and his hope for revolution. The program, by all modern standards, is a collation of reformist measures, the kind of action that helps make capitalism more tolerable, the revolution, in consequence, less imminent.
A heavy progressive for graduated income tax, free education for all children in public schools, equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction...
In one way or another, in the advanced capitalist countries, much of this got done. And these reforms did help to take the raw edge off capitalism, did without doubt have the effect of postponing that forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions for which Marx had hoped. Thus did Marx the reformer defeat Marx the revolutionist. The revolution, when it came in those countries, Imperial Russia, China, where the reforms Marx urged were never known. By 1848, as a subversive, Marx was at the head of all the police lists. The Belgians, though more liberal than their neighbors, were also nervous about harboring so dangerous a man. But on almost the same day that he was expelled from Brussels, he was invited back to France. That was because 1848 was the year of revolutions in Berlin, Vienna, Prague, and here in Paris. Many people still connect that year with Marx and the Manifesto. Neither had an appreciable influence. The revolutions came, but the words of the Manifesto were still all but unknown.
All revolutions have a geographical center. The French Revolution had its center, its great center on the Place de la Bastille. And the revolution of 1848, for a Marxist, was centered here on the Luxembourg Gardens.
This might be a good time to reflect on the nature of revolution, what it takes to make a revolution successful. Revolution is a word that comes very easily to our lips. If conservatives knew how hard it is to have a revolution, they would be far less worried than they are about the danger. They're far, far safer than they know.
Three conditions are absolutely essential. There must be determined leaders, men who know exactly what they want, men who know that they have everything to gain, and also that they have everything to lose. They must have disciplined followers, men who will accept orders, won't think for themselves. It's my impression that this also is inconsistent with the revolutionary tendency. People who participate in revolutions do want to think for themselves. Well, that can't be allowed. And finally, the other side must be weak. All revolutions are the kicking in of a rotten door. They're by men who charge ruthlessly into a vacuum. All of these three conditions were present in the Russian Revolution of 1917. All three conditions were present in the Chinese Revolution after World War II. And all of these three conditions were absent here in France in 1848.
By then, Marx was again on his way. He had never had much hope for the success of the revolution, but he did write its epitaph.
The Paris workers have been overwhelmed by superior forces. They have not succumbed to them. The momentary triumph of brutal violence has been purchased with the fracturing of the French nation into two nations. The nation of the possessors and the nation of the workers. The tricolor republic now bears only one color. The color of the defeated. The color of blood.
Marx had been without hope because he thought the revolutionary sequence was wrong.
He was unquestionably confirmed in his view that the bourgeois revolution, the capitalist revolution, had to come first. And then, and only then, could the true revolution of the workers succeed.
Marx went on to Cologne, to another brief job as an editor. In Cologne, he was still a voice for moderation. Let there be no reckless, adventurous action by workers that would lead only to disaster. He was not heard. In Germany, too, revolutionary rhetoric was far in advance of the reality of power, and the revolt was crushed. Still, there was change. Before 1848, the old feudal classes and the new capitalists were in conflict. After 1848, they were united against the new threat of the workers, and they would stay united until the great ungluing of World War I. Nowhere would the Union be more secure than in Prussia, where Marx had his greatest hopes for revolutionary success. Moderate or not, Marx was now sent packing again. He gave thought to going to the United States, but he didn't have the money. Who will say how much he was missed? It had to be London, his last move. He crossed the Channel on August 24, 1849. Behind him were several lifetimes, and he was all of 31. Before him lay three great tasks: forming the ideas that would guide the masses in revolution, creating the force that would bring the revolution, and making a living. All would be accomplished by words from his pen, a literal sea of words. Marx got financial help from Engels and from other friends. There was an occasional inheritance windfall from Trier, and there was the New York Tribune. 1857, when times were lean, the Tribune fired all of its foreign correspondents but two, and Marx was one of the two that was kept. But Marx was a terrible hand with money. Where before his movements were at the behest of the police, now they were in advance of angry landlords and angry creditors. Thus, further migrations, ending up at last at number 28 Dean Street, Soho. Children came, 6 in all, and 3 of them died in the squalid, crowded rooms on the second floor. Marx continued to attract the thoughtful attention of the Prussian police. In 1852, a wonderfully literate police spy sent to Germany an account of the Marx menage.
As father and husband, Marx, in spite of his wild and restless character, is the gentlest and mildest of men. Marx lives in one of the worst, therefore one of the cheapest quarters of London. He occupies 2 rooms. The one looking out on the street is the salon, and the bedroom is at the back. In the whole apartment, there is not one clean and solid piece of furniture. Everything is broken, tattered, and torn, with a half-inch of dust over everything and the greatest disorder everywhere.
In London, he had another great resource, one that has been much celebrated. That was the library of the British Museum. It was in the British Museum that Marx wrote his enduring testament, Capital, Das Kapital. To summarize the central thesis of Capital must seem presumptuous. Yet if one gives only conclusions, not supporting argument, it is not impossible. Ricardo, as I hope some will recall, gave the world the labor theory of value, the proposition that the value of a product is based on the value of the labor needed to make it. Further, said Ricardo, there would be an ineluctable tendency for wages to fall to the lowest level necessary to sustain life. Landlords would do well, but workers would only just survive. Where Ricardo left off, Marx began. For Marx, the value that labor gave a product became a right, a thing to which labor was entitled. What labor did not get was what Marx called surplus value. This surplus value, profit more or less, was available to the capitalist for investment in plant and machinery as industrial capital. The capitalist was now the beneficiary, not the landlord. But Ricardo's iron law of wages still applied. Capitalists prospered, workers lived at subsistence level. Wages were kept down by unemployment. The unemployed were an industrial reserve army, always awaiting jobs, always keeping down wages. If the capitalist should re-employ all this labor, wages would rise. Profits would then fall, production would cease to be worthwhile, there would be a crisis, later called a depression. Then the unemployment that workable capitalism required, in Marx's view, would be restored. The profits of the capitalist would be used for investment, also by the large capitalists to gobble up the small ones, the process of capitalist concentration. In consequence of this concentration, individual capitalists would grow bigger and stronger, but the system as a whole, since its political base rested on ever smaller numbers, would become weaker. This weakness, in combination with a falling rate of profit and the increasingly severe depressions, would make the system progressively more vulnerable to overthrow. Confronted by the disciplined proletariat it created, it would be overthrown.
Along with the constantly diminishing number of magnates of capital, who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers, and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production which has sprung up and flourished along with and under it. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated.
You see the carbuncles on Marx's face. He once warned the capitalists that they would suffer for them. There was for capitalists one comfort. Their end would come not with a whimper, but with a wonderful bang. The first volume of Capital was not published until 1867, and the second two volumes were not published in Marx's lifetime. They were completed from notes by the ever-faithful Engels, could have been completed by no one else. One reason for the delay was the early poverty and struggle. Another was scholarship. Marx was incapable of writing anything until he had read everything. Another reason was the endless swirl of discussion and debate and polemic in which Marx lived. In these years also, Marx was laying the foundations for the revolution which he hoped, but never quite believed, was imminent. His instrument was an organization that would link together the workers of the industrial countries, those proletarians who, as Marx powerfully averred, knew no motherland. Now known as the First International, this revolutionary instrument was born in London on September 28, 1864, at a meeting attended by some 2,000 workers, trade unionists, and assorted intellectuals from all over Europe. A council was selected to which Marx became the secretary. The resolutions that were actually passed by the International, calling for limitations on working hours, state support for education, nationalization of railways, were not very revolutionary. When it was over, Marx sent a final saddened address to the council of the dying First International.
Working men's Paris, with its commune, will be forever celebrated as the glorious harbinger of a new society. Its martyrs are enshrined in the great heart of the working class. Its exterminators, history has already nailed to that eternal pillory from which all the prayers of their priests will not avail to redeem them.
Marx was indulging in wishful thought. Memory is not that long. But with the liquidation of the commune, the first revolution to use, however inaccurately, the root word communism came to an end. It was the only such revolution that Marx was to see. After the Paris Revolt, Marx continued his work.
In his later years, Marx was the world authority on the revolution, but he didn't seem to be in a hurry to make it happen. Young, hot-headed socialists from around the world would come to North London to pay their respects, win his support. Mr. M seemed happy to watch and wait.
Marx only really had contempt for terrorists, those who were seeking to fast forward political progress by having change through arbitrary violence. You needed the economic fundamentals in place for a proper revolution to succeed.
To understand why he didn't want a rush revolution, we need to understand, for the last time, I promise, a bit more Marxist theory. As usual, he had a grand analysis of the history of the world. He saw the great sweep of humanity's endeavours from the caveman to the slave societies of Greece and Rome, to the feudalism of kings and castles, all of which was replaced in turn by our own capitalist system of bosses and workers. Incredibly unfair, but also incredibly productive. Marx said only when we'd got everything we could out of capitalism could we afford to have a revolution. In his words, the knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated, all to be replaced by more or less nothing. Irritatingly, there's next to no alternative laid out.
Marx, basically, was not the one who simply gave us a blueprint, 5 stages after capitalism, communism, here you have the basic guidelines, what to do and so on. No, it's up to us. He just opened up the field.
Marx said we couldn't describe what the next stage of human development would look like any more than a feudal serf could have described our lives today. To which you might say, fair enough. Except you might also think it was pretty telling. After all, nobody else has been able to describe a convincing alternative to capitalism either. We might see a complex modern economy which all of us have a stake in, but Marxists would say the same old rules still apply. For them, who owns what still means everything. They see workers still slaving away, and capitalists, or bourgeoisie, still exploiting them, always striving to make more profit. In Marx's world, any capitalist that doesn't seek maximum profit is soon replaced by one who does. So the system follows a completely predictable course, he would say, to its own destruction.
I think some of the ugliness of capitalism that he saw in the 19th century seems to be reappearing in the 21st. And in a way, we have to keep our perspective on this. Health conditions are much better. Living standards are starting from a higher level. But it is still the case that things aren't the way they ought to be, and they're not moving in the way they should be.
I think he would have written a lot more had he lived 10 years more on what a socialist republic would look like. And who knows, but that might have saved the world a lot of bother.
He also remained the high, although not the undisputed, judge of socialist thought. In 1875, the working class parties of Germany agreed on a program that deeply displeased him. Reform once again replaced revolution, but he also warned that for true communism, the old scar tissue of old capitalist thought must first disappear. Only then would come the great day when society would inscribe on its banners,
"From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs."
Maybe these 12 words converted as many people to communism as all the other millions that Marx wrote in his lifetime. The last years were not for Marx a happy time. In December 1881, Jenny died. A few months later, the first and best beloved of his daughters also died. Distraught and very lonely, Marx too ceased to live. And on March 14th, 1883, with Engels at his side, he died. No one else would so march on from the grave. 50 years after Marx published Capital, the first great revolution took place in his name in Russia. There have been more since. I've often thought that another Marxist legacy is almost as important. That is the emphasis he gave to the role of economic institutions in shaping political and social thought and action, and in doing so, in all societies, what scholars have come to call economic determinism. How we make our living goes far to explain how we act, what we believe, the way we are governed, and the passions we display. And this lesson is a gift of Marx to Marxists and to non-Marxists alike.